Hey, what's up? Welcome to another Crime Dive. My name is Crystal Sky, and if you're anything like me, you find yourself drawn to true crime cases. So that's what I talk about here. If you like true crime, and you also want to feel better about your makeup skills, you should totally subscribe, and come hang out with me every Tuesday where I will take a deep dive look into a true crime case while slapping on the old clown paint. We are well into the spooky season. I love this time of year. How's your spooky Halloween season going so far? You got any fun Halloween plans? Let me know. Now, we're just going to get right into it because we have a lot to go over. We are going to conclude last week's case, the case of David Arnold Brown, all right? If you will remember from last week, we had a pretty bizarre case, right? So we were introduced to the Browns. There was David Arnold Brown, his wife Linda, their baby infant Crystal, Linda's little sister Patty, and David's daughter from his first marriage, Cinnamon. We went over how Cinnamon shot her stepmother in the middle of the night, took an overdose of pills, and was then tried and convicted for the murder of her stepmother at 14 years old. Now, if you remember, there are some things that were off in this case, and to a lot of investigators, they thought something wasn't right, including investigator for the prosecutor's office, Jay Newell. And as Cinnamon was serving her time behind bars, he decided to investigate her father, David Arnold Brown, a little bit more because this guy is kind of suspicious. And we left off last week, part one, when we were getting to know all about David Arnold Brown, right? Who he was, his upbringing, how he came to meet Linda, how he met her when she was only like 12 or 13, and thus he began grooming her. Yes, remember? We went over what a creepo pedo that David was. And we ended by talking about the family friend that lived with the Browns for a period of time. She was given the name Denise Summers in the book I read. And we left off with Denise, gonna move in with the Browns. She was gonna work for David's computer company. And so she got to know them pretty well. And then when she had moved in with David and Linda, Patty was living there. And if you'll remember, Cinnamon kind of bounced between her father and her mother's home. So let's start there with how Patty got to be in this situation, how she came to be living with her big sister and David. So Patty had moved in with Linda and David just a couple of days after her 13th birthday. And she had moved in with them in order to escape her home. Remember, she lived in Riverside, and if you will remember, she was one of 11 children. Yeah. Patty and Linda came from a very, very big family and a single mother. So as such, the home was not exactly the best environment, especially because Patty was being molested and sexually assaulted by some of her brothers. Yeah. Patty was the baby, remember, so she had a few older brothers. I do not think the older brothers, such as like Alan Bailey, Linda's twin brother, I don't think the older siblings like that were doing stuff to her. I think it was the boys that were probably like immediately older than her and around her general age group. But yeah, so not sure exactly which one of the Bailey brothers or how many were doing things to Patty, but yeah, it was not a good situation for her. Now, Patty was only about like 7, 8 years old when David came around for the first time. Remember, he had first met the Bailey family when he was married to his second wife, Lori Carpenter. And of course, we talked about how David just sort of like won over the entire Bailey household. Like these children were, growing up poor and didn't have nice things, couldn't do nice things. And here comes David swooping in and doing all that for them. So yeah, of course, Patty, along with the rest of her siblings, of course, also loved David, loved when he came around and was just completely enamored with him. And remember, Patty was starved for attention. I mean, remember, not only does she have 10 siblings, she's the baby of the family, And Patty said that she enjoyed the attention that David gave her. She felt David gave her the attention that she had just been lacking her whole life. She said that David made her feel special. She said, quote, "David treated me real special. He'd let me sit on his lap and give me attention and tell me I'm a good kid and go out and buy me clothes and make me feel real good about myself." Yeah, and knowing what we know about David, right? We know what he's doing. He's grooming her, just as he had done with Linda. Now, it is said Patty was too young when Linda had married and got with David the first time to really feel, any type of jealousy. I mean, she may have felt envious, because, to her, her big sister was being whisked away by her Prince Charming and she was gonna go live happily ever after, So she might have felt a little envious. But when Linda got with David a second time, time. You know, Patty, she's older. She's like 12. And she was old enough to, you know, start feeling jealousy, you know, and rage. She was so livid that her sister had gotten 2 chances with David, whereas Patty, hadn't even gotten 1. And after all, you know, she was 13. Why wouldn't David wait for her? You know, this is supposedly what Patty is thinking when Linda gets back with David the second time. Now, Linda knew how abusive her sister's household situation was. I don't know if she was aware of the sexual abuse, but she knew it was a pretty, you know, rough go of it over there. I mean, she had grown up in that same environment, right? And as such, Linda would often ask her little sister to stay the weekend at her place so she could at least get out of her abusive household for a couple of days. And I think she started, remember we said that David and Linda ended up moving like all over Southern California. I believe when they first had Patty start coming over, I think they were in Victorville at this point. And I also believe at this point, Cinnamon was living with David and Linda as well. Remember, she was bouncing back and forth. Now, Patty loved visiting her big sister over the weekends, right? She loved it, and she always dreaded going home on Sunday. But then, one day, one of these weekends, Linda pulled her little sister aside and said, hey, if you don't want to go home to Riverside, you don't have to. You can come live with me and David. Of course, this was Patty's dream come true. Not only did David give her attention and stuff, she'd be able to escape that abusive household and be with her big sister, you know? Apparently, there were a lot of heated discussions between Ethel, which were, remember, Linda and Patty's mother, and between Linda and David. She did not want Patty to leave. And it's like, well, Ethel, if you cared so much about your kid, maybe stop, you know, drowning yourself in alcohol and pay attention to what's happening to your daughter. Alan Bailey, Linda's twin brother, and he also did some work for David and his company as well. He thought Patty wanted to move out, you know, because obviously, like, it was going to be a nicer living situation, living with David and Linda. She would, you know, get her own room, and, you know, he knew David, you know, spoiled all of the Baileys with stuff, and he figured that was the motivation behind Patty wanting to move out of the home. I'm not sure if he was aware of the abuse going on. I'm not sure who was aware of it at the time. Not sure. And by that Christmas vacation, Patty had moved in with David and Linda. And I believe at this point when she moves in, they were in Yucca Valley. I believe Cinnamon was living with her mother at this time as well. But like we said, we know Cinnamon bounces back and forth. Patty remembered the exact date that she moved in with Linda and David. It was December 19th, 1981. She was 13 years old. And not long after this date, David and Linda remarried. So remember, Linda is now David's 3rd and 5th wife. So after Yucca Valley, remember, Denise is now living with them. They moved to Brea, and then they moved to Anaheim. And it is when they are here in Anaheim that Cinnamon would live with the family until July of 1983. Now, it is said that Cinnamon, who was 2 years younger than Patty, got along pretty well with her. They would fight occasionally, sort of like as sisters do, but nothing, you know, too bad or violent or anything like that. They were just, you know, 2 completely polar opposite personalities. And yeah, their relationship was described as, yeah, maybe being like casual friends. Now, for whatever reason that no one could really put their finger on, it is said Cinnamon didn't quite fit in with the Brown household. And I'm wondering if maybe it's because she has a little bit of an independent streak in her. Remember, we went over this last week, David likes a very tight control over the women in his life, and he purposely preys on young, impressionable, vulnerable girls, you know? So I get the sense that Cinnamon she kind of had like a little bit of an independent streak in her, and, you know, as we know, a control freak like David does not appreciate that. Patty was described as very quiet and solemn, not being too bright. She also did not really catch on to like sarcasm or jokes all that often, where Cinnamon, you know, was very outgoing and was quippy and witty and, you know, often pulled and told all kinds of jokes and pranks, right? So yeah, not really shocking that the two of them, you know, wouldn't be like super close, right? Whereas Cinnamon hated doing chores and had to be told to do them. Patty, who had of course, you know, grown up with disorder and chaos all around her, loved being neat and tidy and always took care of all the possessions that she had. It is said Cinnamon and Linda got along, you know, quite well. And reports by witnesses say that it seemed that, you know, Cinnamon was sort of accepting of Linda as her mother, despite the fact that Linda was like, you know, barely 21 years old. And David would be the only one who said Cinnamon would be sent back to her mother's because she argued with Linda. Now, unlike Cinnamon, who, you know, we just said has a little bit of an independent, rebellious streak in her, right? Patty Patty was not that way at all. She was an avid rule follower and was said to just obey and follow David around like any good cult member would. She was completely devoted to him. Now, it was obvious to everyone in like the Bailey family that, it was obvious that Patty had some sort of crush on David, okay? But, we mentioned this in part 1 last week. Most people just assumed that, it's just one of those harmless, like adolescent crushes that you get, but then you get over it as you get older and start dating like your peers and stuff. And that's what a lot of people assumed it was. David treated the family to all kinds of trips and events, shooting cans in the desert, camping, fishing, going to theme parks, to the movies. And though he was like not athletic by any means, yeah, he was like the family organizer, and he always took his family out on these trips. And if Cinnamon was living with the family at the time, she too would join them. Even David's parents would occasionally join. But even with his lucrative salary, remember, Data Recovery is doing quite well, and David is pulling down like a 6-figure income, and this is in 1980s, all right? That's 1980s money. But those around him, his family, they noticed that even though he had a nice salary and a nice living, they saw how quickly that David grew bored of his possessions, of his toys. So one time, Larry Bailey, that's one of Linda and Patty's brothers, he was, I believe, out on a camping trip with the family, and he had taken out one of the ATV vehicles and went out four-wheeling, right? And when he was out, he kind of like, I think, bent the frame a little bit and kind of beat it up just a skosh. But David, he was not at all worried about this. And in fact, he saw this as an opportunity. He told Larry, like, hey, I mean, if we go out and like really mess this thing up, like push it off a cliff, dude, insurance will give me the money and we can get like a better upgraded one. And that's exactly what they did. And this would be David's pattern in order to get like the latest, biggest, baddest toys that he wanted. He collected on a number of car accidents. Remember last week I told you he was involved in 17? Yeah, now we know why. He sued a grocery store claiming he had tripped over an extension cord. And he tried getting Alan Bailey, remember Linda's twin brother, to like run over this like shed that he had just full of a bunch of like random possessions he didn't want anymore. And he tried getting Alan to like bulldoze it. I think they had rented a tractor for some reason. But Alan was like, bro, like this is so clearly insurance fraud. Like, no, get out of here. There's no way to justify that this was an accident. And so that one didn't happen. But there were other little like scams and frauds that he was involved with. When an elderly neighbor accidentally like backed into his house in Garden Grove. Now it caused some damage, but it was like kind of like minimal damage, She didn't like, run into the house at full speed or anything. She was backing up. And so, yeah, she had damaged one of the front bedrooms. But like with the ATV, David saw this as an opportunity. And, he saw it as an opportunity to get a new computer. He wanted like a new high-tech IBM computer. And this was the perfect way to get it. So he moved all of his like computer office stuff, like his furniture, his computer, his desk and all of that into the front room that had been damaged. I think it was like a front bedroom or something, and tried to make that look like that was his office that he had worked at, right? He roughed up the computer, threw it off the table, went outside and put some dirt on it. And yeah, in the end, the elderly neighbor's insurance bought David a brand new computer, the state-of-art IBM computer that he wanted. David explained to Linda and Patty that this is what insurance was for. It was to pay people for their losses, and so he was just using as it was intended. Yeah, okay. Now, during the summer of 1984, when Linda is pregnant with baby Crystal, David had the income at this point to provide his upcoming daughter with all the things he hadn't been able to provide Cinnamon with, right? I mentioned that in part 1, like the whole house was furnished with brand new furniture and just toys and things. And this included baby Crystal's bedroom. So the Browns settled into their home in Garden Grove. David and Linda, of course, took the back master bedroom. Patty got the large front bedroom, and baby Crystal got the middle bedroom. Linda spared no expense decorating her future child's nursery. She really, really enjoyed sprucing it up, getting ready for her child. But though Linda, was happy for her upcoming baby, it said the last few months of her pregnancy really affected her self-esteem, really had an impact on her. She felt really like hot and uncomfortable in the Southern California heat, and she constantly covered up with layers, which made her more uncomfortable because she was so self-conscious about how big she had gotten. Meanwhile, Patty, who, remember, is living with the family, she's 16 and, has a fantastic body and looks good in shorty shorts and tank tops and stuff, So this was not doing Linda's self-esteem any favors. And there was also something else that began to nag at Linda. So, remember we said Denise, the family friend, had lived with the family, and she lived with them for some time. I think she had moved out before the family had moved to Garden Grove. It's hard to keep track because they lived in so many different places. But even when she moved out, she continued to, be friends with Linda. She said, quote, "I would say Linda was my best friend, but that I was good friends with Patty and Cinnamon." So during the summer of 1984, when Linda's pregnant and is just feeling really self-conscious and, just not really enjoying her body or anything at the moment, she confided in Denise and told her that she thought David and Patty, quote, "had an affair going." So Linda could see that Patty's seemingly innocent schoolgirl crush was not going away, and in fact, it was developing into full-blown lust, especially as she got older, right? And remember, Linda knew the signs. I mean, she had been there herself not too long ago, She slowly felt herself grow distant from David. He used to never go into work without her, but now he did, and sometimes he even went with Patty. She constantly told her mother, and remember Patty's mother, Ethel, that she wanted her little sister to move back home to Riverside. She was not really enjoying her company anymore. Linda confided in her friend that she thought David was spending way too much time on Patty, giving her way too much attention, and not giving her, Linda, who was pregnant with his child, not giving her enough attention. She told Denise that she finally had blown up one time, all right? She had had enough, and she demanded that David take Patty back to Riverside. And so David and Patty had packed up all of her suitcases and all her stuff and headed back to Riverside. But when they got there, David had phoned up Linda and told her, quote, "I'm not coming back without her. That's the way it's going to be." And Linda had relented. Remember, this was the dynamic of Linda and David's relationship. He would make the decisions, always get the final say, while Linda always deferred to him and always backed down. Remember, David likes his women to be submissive. But whatever the trouble with Patty was, by the time Linda had given birth to Crystal on July 20th, 1984, things seemed to be fine. Cinnamon was living with the family at this point, and it said everyone just really, really adored baby Crystal. Like, they loved just fawning over her and giving her attention. Like, everyone loved the baby. In September of 1984, Linda had finally taken Cinnamon to the side and had told her, like, "Hey, I don't mind if you want to live here. Like, in fact, we would love for you to come here and be a part of the family. However, if you decide to do that, well, like, you need to commit to staying here. No more bouncing back and forth." Like, I think Linda, it seemed to be like Linda wanted to offer her maybe like a stable household, because remember, since her parents had divorced when she was 4, Cinnamon had not like stably stayed with one parent or the other. She'd constantly bounced back and forth. And apparently Linda had said, like, "Look, that's all well and cool. You can come live with us, but like, it's going to be like a permanent thing. You're going to be part of this family. You're going to do your chores. You're going to obey, And it is said that, Cinnamon was totally fine with this. She reacted just fine to this and was like, "Yeah, okay, cool. It's understandable." So remember, Cinnamon moved in and started the school year in 1984 in September. And then remember, there were some disputes that she started in June because she did need to take summer school. But yeah, regardless, that year in 84, she had moved in with the family and had started attending Bolsa Grande with Patty. Bolsa Grande. I don't know why I can't say that. Things seemed to be going, well in the Brown household. David and all his women all dancing to his tune and obeying the rules. He was king of his own little fiefdom. So one time, when Linda was visiting with Denise, it was a few months after Crystal had been born, she confided in her friend that though she had relented about Patty moving back to Riverside, she had never really dropped the subject, and she finally confronted David on if anything, quote, funny was going on between him and her sister. David admitted that yes, he knew that Patty had a crush on him, and told Linda that her little sister had even made a move on him. But he told her that she had shot her down, explaining that she was just a kid after all. And Denise says that this was the start of a new Linda, of a more secretive, a little paranoid Linda. She described her friend even as, quote, distrustful, even with her herself. She said before, Linda was very friendly and warm and open. But yeah, around this time, she started closing off and started just becoming very distrustful of everyone. Denise said that after Christmas of 1984, things got even worse with Linda. She said her friend was very cold and stilted. But Denise thought maybe part of the problem was that when she talked to Linda, she wondered if David wasn't listening in. Because at the home, there was like this like speaker system, and there was like a phone speaker in like almost every room of the house. Like evidently evidently David had a lot of conference calls and he walked around, I don't know, like getting paperwork here and there or whatever. And so he had installed like this speaker system so that like when he was taking a conference call, he could sort of take a call from like any room in the house. And Denise, knowing how sort of like possessive and weird David is, was wondering if maybe he wasn't monitoring his wife's phone calls. And she thought if maybe that was kind of part of the reason Denise just did not seem like herself. And again, this started around the holidays of 84. So remember last week we mentioned that Jay Newell, I keep wanting to say Newell, but it keeps coming out Newell. As you can see, like I'm having trouble saying it, but so we're gonna go with Newell, right? So remember, he's the investigator for the prosecutor's office, and he had been sort of keeping a tab on David, kind of keeping an eye on him because he thought he was, weird and suspicious. And remember, last week I said that part of the reason why he thought David was suspicious was not only were there like certain facts in the story that weren't adding up, but David's blasé behavior after the murder of Linda is really what raised an eyebrow as well. So let's get a little bit into that blasé behavior. So after the murder of Linda and the incarceration of Cinnamon, David was just living the high life. Living the high life, guys. He told anyone who would listen how distraught he was over his whole predicament. That his daughter had been left an orphan by his other daughter. That seeing Cinnamon only reminded him of Linda, but she needed him more than ever. He blamed himself for not getting Cinnamon more help and not doing more to get her help. And though his words expressed grief and sorrow, his actions did not. So David cashed in on $769,043 in life insurance policies that he had on Linda. Once again, remember, we're in the 80s. That's 80s money, y'all. He had taken 4 life insurance policies out on Linda in their 3 years of marriage. He had taken out a $100,000 double indemnity policy that was with National Life Insurance, and a similar policy with New York Life Insurance, a $200,000 plus an additional $150,000 accidental death benefit from Capital Life Insurance. Now, I'm not sure which, but 2 of these policies I just listed were actually purchased just a couple of months before Linda's murder. Remember, Linda was in her early 20s, y'all. She was like 23, and David had insured her to the hilt. He had even squeezed out an additional $73,750 in a settlement with Liberty Life Insurance. So he had gotten a grand total of $842,793 from Linda's death. The book I read said that it was $843,626 total dollars. But all in all, he made out like a bandit with Linda's murder. It also turns out that David had a life insurance policy on his 14-year-old daughter Cinnamon as well. And if she would have died from the overdose, he would have received a grand total of $1.2 million. Now, what is so strange about, not just buying these really big life insurance policies for your very young wife a couple months before her murder, but yeah, the fact that she was so young and, didn't have an education or anything, that would have, if he would have taken out one big policy on her, that would have raised a red flag, right? She would have been overinsured. So instead, David had gone around and taken out just smaller policies with other insurance companies. And that is how he had been able to have these multiple policies on Linda without raising a bunch of red flags. Now, after the murder, when David had come into the bank to deposit these very large checks, that young bank teller helped him. Remember, it was the young bank teller who noticed that Linda talked to her as if she was desperate for a friend. So she, continued helping David after the murder, and he came in to cash those checks. So this teller, she's about 18 or 19, and she had some thoughts on David. So when he had come in to cash these large checks, and she's like, oh wow, that's pretty large, David explained, well, Linda was, quote, essential to his business. And the payoffs were so he could restaff his business because Linda was so, integral, important to his work. Now, the teller, she thought this was strange because, though Linda seemed, perfectly bright or whatever, she saw how young she was. She saw her with the baby, and she had talked to her a few times and was like, how is this chick essential to your computer business? And over the next few weeks/months, whenever David would come into this bank, he would request this bank teller. Even if she was busy with other clients, he would just wait. So as such, this bank teller started noticing some things. First, she noticed that Patty came in with David instead of Linda. She noticed that Patty looked an awful lot like her sister, which was spooky enough. But she then noticed that Patty was coming dressed in her sister's clothes, even wearing her sister's jewelry. She was like holding and caressing baby Crystal as if the child were her own. And yeah, all this, the teller thought it was really creepy and weird. And it got even weirder and creepier when David started hitting on this bank teller. Yeah, trying to like get her to come over and stuff, and just being a oily, slimy weasel. And this bank teller, she had had enough, and she got to a point where she would just hide in the back when she saw David coming in and would just tell like her manager and other coworkers like, I'm not here, you're gonna have to deal with him. She was very thankful when David finally moved away. So David ended up buying a nice home, one of several, and these nice homes were always, complete with like pool and hot tub. And the first home he bought after Linda's murder was a very nice lavish mansion in the exclusive Anaheim Hills area. And he bought this home 5 months after the murder. And David had also paid $330,000 cash for it. David bought 3 flashy cars to go in his fancy 3-car garage. Well, actually, David switched cars more often than people switch underwear. In 3 years, he went through 15 expensive, flashy cars. He had other nice assets, such as a very nice motorhome and 2 weathered brick barbecues. He was living the high life. Like, he got almost $1 million from Linda's murder. And David moved himself, baby Crystal, Patty, and his parents into this lavish mansion in Anaheim Hills. Now, remember, Noelle was keeping tabs on David, so whenever he bought new property or whenever he filed insurance claim or anything, Noelle knew. And he had also found out, where David lived and had taken to scoping it out, And he would often see David and Patty leaving together. And without David's knowledge, he was being investigated and documented by Noelle. Now, Noelle ended up filling, notebook after notebook of information on David. He didn't know, why exactly he was doing this. He didn't even know if this information would ever come into play, but he knew he had to keep scratching that itch that told him, something wasn't right with this case, and David was the key. Now, Noelle tried for quite some time without success to try to have some sort of, face-to-face interaction with David, but every time he'd go to the house, David would just, so happen to be preoccupied or on a call or not there or not feeling well. And it was usually either Manuela or Arthur, remember David's parents, or Patty who would answer the door. Sometimes they wouldn't even answer the door. They would answer through the speaker system and say, oh, well, the alarm system is set. We don't need to turn it off. So yeah, sorry. David was definitely avoiding Noelle like the plague. But unbeknownst to Noelle, right? Things were not all well in the Brown household. Manuela would grumble that Patty didn't belong here anymore. She had no business being with David, and that she needed to go back to her own family. Arthur would secretly agree, and he thought Patty was a bad influence on David. Think you got that backwards there, Arthur. And Manuel and Arthur did not like Patty at all. But other than that, things were going swimmingly for David. Data recovery was booming. He brought in more and more family members, even Alan Bailey again, to help with his workload and his business. And as his business grew, so did David's bravado. Now, there are several executives at RandomX. Remember, they were the ones that really gave data recovery a leg up by hiring data recovery as their subcontractor. Well, there were some executives here that were starting not to be a fan of David. And they dispute David's claims that he invented the all-so-secretive process. They said in actuality, this process they had been developed over many, many years by a team of people. Now, at first, this bravado of David's didn't really ruffle any feathers. He was just a subcontractor after all. He didn't really have face-to-face interaction with the clients. But as his bravado grew and his ego grew, David started venturing out on his own, and he made some of RandomX's clients his clients directly, which I'm not sure how he could get away with that. Isn't that against the law? David was said to have been so adept at diagnosing the problem on the disk that he could usually quote a fee for its data retrieval before he had ever gotten his hands on the actual disk. And David usually demanded the money up front, and he claimed he always undercharged. He could have charged a lot more, but he had the best prices in town, and that's why people came to him. So, at this point, despite, ruffling some feathers at the upper heads at RandomX, David was doing well. His business was booming, and he was boasting a high salary. Then, on July 1st, 1986, David and Patty got married in Las Vegas. Yeah, they got married next to a friend couple of theirs who also got married. Now, it depends on who you ask as to why David and Patty got married. Patty claims that they got married because David was dying and it would be way easier for her to get custody of Crystal if they were married. David claims that the marriage to Patty was actually a ruse, all right? It was all a farce. David said that they got married because the female of the friend couple that they got married beside was the one pressing for it, all right? And she was pressuring the man of the couple to get married. And so David said he and the dude then went and paid $300 to have a prenuptial agreement brought up. And David had his say that in the event of the divorce, he pretty much got to keep everything and Patty would get nothing. But Patty, she didn't care. She didn't even really read it, and she signed it the day before they were to be married. David said he and Patty falsified as much information as they could on the license and certificate, and because of that, they weren't really married. Really, David, then why would you have a prenuptial agreement signed up if it wasn't real? Now, David made Patty hide the fact they were married. She couldn't wear a ring. They couldn't openly acknowledge their marriage. They couldn't go on a honeymoon. And David was adamant that they never tell Cinnamon about their union. Now, whenever David did get around to visiting his daughter, he would sometimes bring his parents. Sometimes he would bring one or the other, or both. And Patty would either stay home or she would stay out in the trailer in the parking lot, because he would drive his trailer up there, and stay there while David visited Cinnamon. And a year later, still no one knew about the marriage. And so David was able to continue living his life secretly as man and wife with Patty, alongside his parents and baby Crystal. Meanwhile, behind bars, Cinnamon had no physical address, no phone number, or any way to directly contact her father. She had like a business P.O. box that she could send stuff to, but that was about it. David would come and visit his daughter every other Saturday when she was allowed to have visitors. And every time he would tell her just what a trek it was just to make it up there, because he was so sick. His health was so fragile and he was dying. And every time he visited, Cinnamon was scared to death that this would be the last time she would see her father. And she was also frustrated because their visits seemed to be so short that she never was able to ask her father the really important questions that were nagging at her. He would just either be evasive or just say things like, quote, "I'm working on it. I'm contacting lawyers, investigators. You'll be out of here soon." And she believed him. David kept her commissary card fully stocked. She was able to order things and charge it to his business account. She lived in a solitary cell that they called cottages, and was able to, at least make it as homey as she could, including putting like nice curtains over the bars and stuff. She got her high school diploma behind bars, even her AA degree, and she got some sort of job like working with computers or something. She worked out, got into needlepoint, and just quietly lived her life behind bars. Whenever she was asked about Linda's murder, Cinnamon would just respond that she didn't remember anything about that night. Her memory was blank, but she was adamant she did not shoot her stepmother. And one day, she would be proven innocent. She refused psychiatric treatment and kind of seemed like frightened at the thought of like psychologists or psychiatrists like poking at her subconscious or something. She was not a fan of that. Though she had taken advantage of every other program that the facility offered, hence her AA degree and stuff, the one thing she refused to participate in is group therapy. Cinnamon came up for parole and early release quite a few times over the few years that she was behind bars, and every time she was denied, and it was because of her, quote, refusal to address Linda's murder. And as the board saw it, Cinnamon hadn't confessed to her crime and hadn't really dealt with it, and they would always recommend psychiatric treatment. Now, Cinnamon, again, just plodded away behind bars. She didn't associate with any of the gangs at CYA, remember the California Youth Authority where she's locked up, and she seemed content to just kind of be a loner. Some described Cinnamon as almost as if she was waiting for something, and waiting for something that was going to set her free. It was like she was biding her time behind bars. And to those who observed her in jail, they just found it really odd that this placid, easygoing, quiet child would just shoot someone in cold blood in the middle of the night like that. Now, on one of the trips that David came to visit Cinnamon, he brought Arthur, his father, with him. I think Manuela stayed behind with Patty and Crystal. And at some point, when I think David went off to go to the bathroom or something, so Cinnamon was alone with her grandfather. And it was when they were alone that Arthur let it slip that he knew something. He knew who really killed Linda. And when the time was right, he would tell all he knew. Yeah, so, this definitely piqued Cinnamon's interest, and when she came up for another, parole hearing, she relayed this information to the parole board. Now, apparently, this piqued the parole board's interest too, and so they requested that the Orange County DA's office have an investigator sort of look into this potential new information, and as we know, Newell is way ahead of the game. So, in late January of 1987, Patty and David have secretly been married about 6 months. Newell set out to question Arthur about what he potentially knew. He wanted to kind of check out this information. Now, as fate would have it, all right, it's just out of a movie. As fate would have it, Newell happened to catch the Brown household when David was gone. He was away from the home, and Arthur just happened to be in the front yard by himself. Isn't that a coinky-dink? So Newell approached Arthur, told him who he was, and even though Arthur seemed kind of sketchy and dodgy at first, Newell was able to coax some vital tidbits from Arthur. Arthur said yes, he had told his granddaughter, quote, "I told Cindy that I felt like I know who planned it because I heard her say that she was going to do something to save David." Now, who was she? Well, it was none other than Patty, the quote, "foul-mouthed bitch," is how Arthur referred to her. Arthur said that one time, himself, David, Cinnamon, Linda, and Patty all went for a picnic, all right? And then they stopped at some rest area, and Linda got out to use the restroom. So Arthur was sitting in the very back of the van, seemingly forgotten, and he heard Patty, who was up towards the front, talk about, quote, that she heard Linda planning to do away with David, to take his business. And she said that wasn't going to happen. Even if she had to do it herself, she'd get rid of her. Now, this, of course, is a pretty huge break. Now, at that moment, David came home, and Newell, because he's an investigator, easily, was able to pass himself off as a realtor in the area or whatever. And so he was able to, leave, and David none the wiser. However, before the night was through, Arthur confessed to his son who Newell was and what he had told him. And David, of course, was pissed off. He called his father a, quote, fool, told him he had jeopardized the whole family, and he became super paranoid, more paranoid than before. He told Patty to burn their marriage certificate and their prenup and to burn it, which again, I'm not sure what he's thinking, it's still on file, it's still official. You think because you burn the physical copy that it's gone? That's not how that works. And he restricted Patty's movements even more. He gave her a beeper so that he could contact her whenever he wanted, and she was not allowed to go anywhere without his say-so. It is said that he would page her every 15 minutes to check on where she was. David just became completely paranoid after this, all right? And David's paranoia ramped up even more when it was noticeable that Patty had a little bit of a bump situation going on. Patty had a baby bump. Now, of course, just to spell it out for you, yes, David and Patty were sleeping together. Yes, they had engaged in an affair. And yeah, he had actually been, grooming and molesting Patty for quite some time. And they were actually intimate and sleeping together even before Linda's murder. By the time Patty was 15 years old, her and David were having regular sexual intercourse. I know, ew. Now, Patty, of course, was thrilled at this affair. She had admired David since she was a little girl, and saw him as her knight in shining armor. She obeyed David as if he were God, as if his word was gold. And now that her sister was gone, it is said Patty was happily living in her place. Remember we talked about how she was wearing Linda's clothes and wearing her jewelry and just sort of assuming her place? Well, Patty had also methodically went through the whole house and had taken out any pictures with Linda in them. Yeah. And though David had her on a very tight leash, Patty was super happy. And even though she couldn't acknowledge her union with David, she thought she was in love with him and thought she had been in love with him for quite some time. Now, long ago, Patty had lied to David and told him that she was infertile, all right? She was not capable of becoming pregnant. And so David had never bothered to use protection when they were together. Well, obviously, Patty was lying, hence her baby bump, and she became pregnant in the back end of 1986. Don't ask me how she had avoided getting knocked up until this point. Don't ask me. Now, this pregnancy was not a happy occasion, all right? David was pissed. He said the pregnancy made him look bad, that the cops were now going to look at them even harder, and how were they going to look at them now? And he just went on and on. He was not happy. David demanded that Patty get an abortion, but for once, Patty did not do as David wanted. She stood up to him and said, no, I'm not getting an abortion. She was determined, that she could be better than Linda, that she could give David everything that he wanted, including a better child. Now, when it became obvious that Patty was pregnant and you couldn't hide it anymore, David denied that he was the father. Straight out denied it. He actually said a man named Doug, who lived down the street, was the father. And to further this ruse, he actually sent Patty, flowers and notes from this supposed Doug guy. But Arthur, Manuela, Noel from afar, they all knew there was no Doug and that David was obviously the father. Hello, you kept Patty on a super tight leash. Come on, dude. Obviously you're the father. There's no one else it could be. And on September 29th, 1987, Patty gave birth to a daughter who she named Heather Nicole. Patty and David put Doug's name on the birth certificate, and David refused to acknowledge baby Heather as his own. Though he had showered Crystal with gifts and attention and affection, he just completely ignored Heather. Wouldn't even acknowledge her existence. He made Patty pay for her hospital stay resulting from the pregnancy. Remember how he had gotten into all these car accidents and had gotten insurance settlements? One of these accidents was with Patty, and so she had gotten, I don't know, something in the tens of thousands of dollars as a settlement, and that was all the money that she had to her name, and David made her pay for her own hospital stay. And though Patty was barely 20 years old at this point, she had grown too old for David, and she had grown into the antithesis of what he wanted. Now, Patty had stretch marks, and she was a young mother. She fought louder and even harder with Manuela than Linda ever had, and David was now disgusted by Patty. Meanwhile, Cinnamon continued, her formative years behind bars. She kept her day filled with college courses, taking part in, lots of programs and educational opportunities, except for group therapy. She still maintained that she had no memory of that night and still believed that she was innocent. And as 3 years passed, Cinnamon continued this way, taking part in programs and stuff, and denying that she had any memory of that night. The visits from her father became less and less, to the point that they were non-existent. He just stopped coming. Though again, her father kept her commissary account fully stocked with money, but other than that, she had no knowledge of her father's life on the outside. She didn't know about Heather, about Patty, or any of it. She didn't even know where her father lived. Now, Noel, of course, who's tracking David, virtually stalking him a little bit, he would slide photos and information to Cinnamon's parole / social worker officer that she had behind bars. Apparently all of the kids were assigned these, they called them parole officers. And Noel would often, let some information slip in the hopes that it would get back to Cinnamon. Now, Noel would have loved to just, go and talk to Cinnamon, but he couldn't. Because Cinnamon was a minor, he would have to get her guardian or parents' permission, which in this case was David. And of course he wouldn't allow that, right? Then, on July 19th, 1988, after she had already turned 18 years old, Cinnamon's parole officer called up Noel and was like, hey, guess what? Someone wants to talk to you. Now, when Noel got on the line, he heard, the very small, high-pitched voice on the other end. And after she was assured that her father was not listening to this conversation and would not know it had taken place, she said, quote, he was in the wrong for what he did, and I was too young to realize it. I know now that it's time for him to take the responsibility for the crime that's taken taken place. I was a little bit involved because I knew what was going to happen, but I didn't actually do the murder. Yeah, Cinnamon dropped a bombshell, all right? Like, Noelle had been waiting for this for years, and now here was Cinnamon finally telling all. She revealed that it was her father who had instructed her to write her would-be suicide note, and revealed that it was her father who had prepared the prescription cocktail that nearly killed her. He told his daughter to take it to really sell the, murder-suicide theory. She continued on telling Noelle that her father had told her and Patty that Linda, along with her twin brother Alan, were out to get him. And, quote, we had to do something about it. Yeah, what? What is this? Is this not mind-blowing? Cinnamon said herself, Patty, and David would often go on long drives where it was just the three of them. And according to Cinnamon, on these drives, David and Patty would talk about ways to get rid of Linda. Cinnamon said, quote, she suggested hitting her over the head to knock her out different ways. Cinnamon said that her father had told her to take responsibility for the crime, then to say that she didn't remember what she had done that night. She said she heard him drive off after the shots were fired, and that Patty wiped the gun off with a towel. She revealed she was very well aware of baby Heather's presence and existence, and knew that it was her half-sister, that it was her father's child. And it seems to be the child he had with Patty, coupled with his, virtual abandonment of his daughter, had all accumulated in Cinnamon realizing that she had just been used. She had been betrayed and left behind by her father. Hence her phone call. Now, of course, Noelle's he's super excited at this, right? And so he set to work trying to find a DA who would be willing to reopen this case, And he found one. He got Orange County DA Jeff Robinson to take on the case. And he was on board, and so the two got together to go over, okay, what do we need to make this a case, to take this to trial, and to convict? So they knew that Noelle had to get more evidence. Cinnamon's word alone would not be enough. Detective McLean was allowed to come back into the fold and work on the case. Remember, he had also thought something was up with the case from the beginning, so he too was allowed to be brought back on board. And 3 weeks after Cinnamon had phoned Noelle, he and Detective McLean headed out to interview her. And this was on August 10th. And the tale that Cinnamon told them was shocking. You didn't think you could get any more shocked with this case. It is wild. Let's remember, David is Cinnamon's father, okay? So Cinnamon told them that her father had told her and Patty that Linda and her brothers were in the mafia, and they wanted to control and take over his business because he was doing so well. Cinnamon said her father told her and Patty that Linda and Alan wanted to kill him, and that it was up to them, Cinnamon and Patty, to, quote, rescue him. The book that I read for this case recounted an incident that happened 7 months before the murder. And it was a recounting of an event that Cinnamon told Noelle and McLean. So she said herself, Patty and David, they were sitting somewhere in the house, I don't know, in the living room or something. And Linda was on the phone with Alan in another room. Cinnamon said Patty got up, she was gonna go get something, and she stopped when she was outside of the room that Linda was in. She froze for several minutes, then came back to David and Cinnamon and said it sounded like Linda was on the phone with Alan and they were planning on killing David. She was very conspiratorial and was convinced at what she had heard. Now, Cinnamon, she's a joker, she's a prankster, she just laughed and was like, okay, yeah, obviously you misunderstood or something. She knew Patty wasn't that bright and didn't really get jokes anyway and didn't really pick up on sarcasm. So, she assumed you just don't understand. It was some kind of joke. David dismissed it as well, but Patty was adamant. And when they, then were like, okay, well, what exactly did she say? Patty said that she was too scared to discuss this any further in the house because, Linda might overhear. And not too much later, a few moments after that, Linda walked back into the room and the whole topic was dropped. But then the next day, 24 hours later, Cinnamon said Patty, David, and herself were all on their way to a chiropractor's appointment. And David brought this topic up again of Linda plotting to kill him. Cinnamon said that Patty said Linda was going to kill David to get him out of the way. Now, Cinnamon, again, just didn't believe any of it, thinking, quote, Linda wouldn't say something like that. But now, David was adamant that Patty was in fact correct. She had heard correctly. Linda was indeed trying to kill him. And it was all for his money and his business. He started saying Linda was a, quote, changed woman and would stop at nothing to get his money and business. Cinnamon said, quote, "My father kept saying, 'Just believe me. I'm your father. I know she's trying to kill me.'" And from that moment onward, David became very, very paranoid. Cinnamon said that he would often come to her alone, or her and Patty when they were together, and kept saying things like, quote, "Linda's going to try to kill me." And of course, as we know, David, we know the control that David has over his family. We know the grooming he has done of Linda and Patty, even Cinnamon, his daughter. Like, even though the grooming for Cinnamon wasn't exactly, like a sexual one, it was still grooming in that he was molding her and manipulating her emotions, right? And using her. And it's no surprise that, this started freaking the girls out. Neither of them could live without David, albeit for different reasons, but still, like, that was the one thing they had in common. They needed David. Cinnamon didn't know what to do. She didn't dare discuss it with her mother. I'm not sure if that one-off comment is all that she told to her mother, because remember, Brenda had already mentioned this little tidbit about Linda and Alan trying to get rid of David. Remember, they had even talked to Alan about this, and he didn't know what they were talking about. But other than that, Cinnamon had not talked to anyone about this. She was afraid that it would get back to David, and though she loved her father and adored him, she was also, afraid of him. He had a temper. Plus, he had told her not to discuss this with anyone else besides him and Patty, and they could never discuss it inside the house. Now, there are seemingly, no secrets in the Brown household, except for one very big one, all right? And Cinnamon discovered this in January of 1985. So sometime in late January of 1985, Cinnamon, David, Patty, Linda, with baby Crystal, all make a trip to Kmart. Linda stayed behind in the van to change Crystal, so David, Patty, and Cinnamon headed inside. Cinnamon broke away from her father and Patty to go get a cassette. Yes, because we're in the 80s, cassette tapes. So she went and got a cassette, and she, got what she wanted and then headed back and was trying to find her father and Patty. And that is when she rounded the corner, and right outside the clothing department, the women's clothing department, she saw a horrifying sight. Her father was openly making out with teenaged Patty, and Cinnamon was stunned at this, like shocked and stunned, just didn't know what to do. She turned and ran. Her father and Patty did see that she saw, and he took off after her. Cinnamon told her father what she saw, and he said that what she saw was a, quote, accident. And Cinnamon just broke away and just went off into a corner somewhere and freaked out and cried and kind of had a panic attack, She just didn't know what to do. It was such a massive shock to her. And Linda had eventually come in the store, and she was completely flabbergasted when she came across Cinnamon in that state. And though Cinnamon said that she wanted to tell her stepmother what she saw, quote, "At the time, I was scared of my father. Otherwise, I would have been assertive and told Linda." When they all got home, David stopped Cinnamon right outside the house, and after Linda, Crystal, and Patty went inside the house, took Cinnamon aside and said, quote, "Don't tell anybody what you saw in the store. It's very important to me." Cinnamon promised and immediately headed to the backyard to her trailer. She needed to be alone to process this. This was such a major shock to her. She had to go somewhere and process this. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't believe that her father would be doing something like that with a girl around her own age. Remember, Cinnamon is only 2 years younger than Patty. She didn't understand how her father could do that to Linda. It just didn't make any sense. And as the hours and days passed, she even grew more distraught as Linda just tried to reach out and see what was wrong with Cinnamon. She'd bring her dinner and try to talk to her. And of course, this just ate up Cinnamon even more. So in regard to the plot to kill Linda, Cinnamon went on saying, quote, "The next thing I remember happening is me being out in the van with my father and Patty. We were going to cash his check. I heard Patty talking to my father about, we have to get rid of her. My father was all, I don't know how we're going to do it. I sort of oozed into the next seat behind them. And my father looked back at me and he goes, 'What did you hear?' And he said, 'You probably heard it already, so just sit there.'" Patty reminded Cinnamon of the phone conversation she had overheard with Linda and Alan and said, quote, I heard them again, and they said they were going to kill your father. This time, they're serious. But Cinnamon was, still hard to convince. She still couldn't really believe this. She still thought Patty had completely misheard or completely misunderstood. And she thought there was no way Patty could have overheard anything anyway because the speaker system had not been turned on at that time. But Patty just said, quote, I just know, and we have to get rid of her before she kills your father. You don't know Linda. I know Linda. She's my sister. And David added his voice, saying, quote, either we could get rid of Linda or I could leave. Now, Cinnamon was appalled at this idea. This is what really got to Cinnamon. She asked, why they couldn't just get divorced. Why does it have to go to murder? Why can't you just get a divorce? And David said, quote, no, she'll still kill me if I divorce her. I'll just leave you guys with everything and take off and start over again. And this right here, this threat of leaving is really what would ply Cinnamon's mind into being involved with this plot. The threat of David leaving and abandoning her was just more real than anything Patty could have said. David said it was either that or they get rid of Linda. Cinnamon asked, quote, how can I help? She thought maybe she could talk to Linda, but that is when David told her that she was never to discuss this with anyone but him and Patty. And from that moment on, Cinnamon obediently obeyed her father. Again, not sure when she had made that comment to her mother. Maybe it was before this incident. But yeah, other than that, Cinnamon obeyed her father and did not discuss this with anyone. Now, David pondered the idea of just giving Linda a bunch of money to go away. But according to Cinnamon, that is when Patty interjected and said, quote, Patty said, no, that won't work. We'd have to get rid of her. We'd have to kill her. At that time, to me, it just seemed like Patty was talking. I said, how do you plan on killing her? She goes, I've been thinking about that. Maybe hitting her over the head. And I go, with what? She goes, with something hard. And I said, would that kill her? She goes, I think so. And that's when my father butted in. He goes, well, if she hits her hard enough in the right place, it would kill her. Cinnamon said that she couldn't remember how long until they had discussed it again, only that the three of them were on their way to another chiropractor appointment. Quote, my father said, Cinny, it had to happen immediately. He just popped out of the blue with, it has to happen immediately. We have to get rid of Linda as soon as possible. I just know she's going to kill me soon. We can't delay it anymore. It has to happen. Right away. Patty said, yeah, it has to happen. And when Cinnamon, asked them what they had planned to do, David told her that they were going to need her help. He asked his daughter, quote, do you love me, Cinnamon? Cinnamon said, of course she loved her father. He asked, quote, how much do you love me? She told him a whole lot, He said, quote, I want to make sure you love me enough that you'll do anything for me. I'm being serious with you. Cinnamon then thought that her father was planning on leaving and abandoning them. And that's when she started really getting like emotional because she thought oh my God, he's saying goodbye. She started crying and she begged her father not to go. And that's when David asked, quote, well then, how are you going to help me? They all drove along for a little bit. Cinnamon still kind of confused and thinking maybe this was some sort of sick joke, maybe some sort of weird loyalty test that her father was putting her through. And David said, quote, I need you to help me. I need you to help me get rid of her. David told both girls that he couldn't do the deed himself. Not only would he be the obvious suspect, but he was in failing health and he was just too frail. He wouldn't survive in jail. Cinnamon asked her father if he wanted her herself to kill Linda. And he said, quote, I want you to help, yes. And if you feel you have the stomach for it, I want you to do it. Cinnamon responded, quote, I like horror movies, but I don't have the stomach for that. You know me. And that's when David just said, quote, I didn't think you would. I don't either. Cinnamon then asked, well, what about Patty? Does she have the stomach for this? And her father told her that the two had been discussing it. Now, unbeknownst to Cinnamon, according to some sources, David was whispering sweet little nothings in Patty's ear, promising to marry her as soon as her sister was out of the way. But he told her he just couldn't bring himself to do it. Cinnamon was so confused and emotional and terrified at this point, but David, who was calm, confident, and authoritative, just said, quote, if you love me, you'll trust me. Just believe what I say. I'm your father. I know what's best. I cannot believe a parent would be doing this to their child. Y'all, it's so bizarre. Now, Cinnamon said that the next time the subject of Linda's murder was brought up was when Patty, David, Linda, Crystal, and herself along with David's parents, all went to a hospital in Riverside. There was a family member who had a baby, and they were all gonna see the new baby. This was approximately a month before Linda's murder. So Cinnamon and baby Crystal had to stay in the lobby, and Arthur stayed behind with them. And as they were sitting there, Arthur asked Cinnamon if she was aware of any plot between Alan and Linda to harm David. Cinnamon just told him that that was for her father to tell him. Patty and David joined them soon after this. And again, David reiterated that Linda was planning to kill him. Patty piped up that they were going to take care of Linda on the way home. The plan was, as they were on the freeway, in the van, Patty was going to push her sister out of the sliding door as David went near the speed limit. Yeah, can you believe this is her sister, by the way? They had disengaged the light that would alert when the door, wasn't closed all the way. Apparently they had disengaged the light. So yeah, the plan was not to shut the door all the way. Now, David told his father not to tell Manuela because she was a, quote, big mouth. Arthur said David shouldn't do this, but just then, Linda, Crystal, and Manuela came to the group. And then the family headed home, driving in the van. But when the time came, when the moment of truth came, Patty couldn't do it. She crawled back to where Cinnamon was sitting, near the back, and told Cinnamon, no, you do it. And Cinnamon was like, no. Not only am I not ready for this, I'm not even physically strong enough. Nah, get out of here. Cinnamon said at this point, she locked eyes with her father in the rearview mirror, and she just shook her head no. No, she wasn't going to be able to do this. The family stopped at a fast food restaurant, and when they were leaving, Patty was the first one to the car, and she quickly slid into her seat. Cinnamon was close behind, and Patty told Cinnamon that she, quote, needed to do it. Cinnamon told Patty that she didn't know jack of what she needed to do. Patty then told her, quote, if you love your father, you'll do it. Can you believe this chick? Look, I know Patty's a victim too, but dude, again, Cinnamon told her, I just don't have that in me. Patty then said, quote, you don't love your father. Otherwise, you wouldn't have any hesitation. You'd go do it. Well, what about you, bitch? Huh? What about you? You can't do it. Now, the guilt trips that David and Patty were laying on Cinnamon, they're starting to take their toll, all right? Remember, Cinnamon's only 13, 14 when this topic has first been brought up. And now, she's 14 and is being guilt tripped. But fortunately, at this moment, Arthur came out and he pulled Cinnamon aside and said, quote, he's a sick man. I'm telling you now, he's a sick man. And yeah, he just told his granddaughter, don't do this, And so the family made it home safe and sound, Linda not having any idea she had been to being murdered in cold blood. And what a gnarly way to go out too, right? And after this point, every time David, Cinnamon, and Patty were alone together, they talked about Linda's murder. And Cinnamon said the closer that they would draw to the date of Linda's murder, the more urgency there was in David and Patty's voices. And through her manipulative father, who had been grooming her pretty much since birth, and the constant guilt tripping by her father and Patty, Cinnamon slowly grew to accept this plot they were hatching, kind of normalized it in her brain a little bit, And David wasn't just pressuring his daughter to do the deed herself. He was pressuring her to take the rap when Linda was finally killed. He told her that due to her young age, she'd get less time, if any at all. He said that they'd probably just send her to a psychiatrist because they'd think that she was, quote, crazy. He said he and Patty, we were too old now and we would get much more time, whereas, Cinnamon was only 14 and she wouldn't get nearly as much time, so it made sense for her to do it. And then on St. Patrick's Day weekend, 1985, so the weekend, we're talking days before Linda's murder, David planned a long, out-of-the-way camping trip to Riverside, mountains of Riverside. But a few days before they were to take this trip, David had Cinnamon write a few notes, and they were akin to, I didn't mean to do it. So Cinnamon wrote, Dear God, please forgive me. I didn't mean to hurt her. She put her own touch on the note by wrapping it in a ribbon. David then told her to hide it in the trailer. He then had Cinnamon load the cars with supplies, food and stuff like that. But he also had her pack lots and lots of weapons. They were going to go shooting, and so he had her load up the BB guns and a bunch of other guns that David owned. Now, Linda did not want to go on this camping trip at all, but as we know, what David wants, David gets. David's parents also went with them on this trip. And so on Saturday, March 16th, the Brown family headed out on this trip. Now, it is said that there was a lot of tension in the air. Linda did not want to go camping with baby Crystal, and David snapped and sniped at Cinnamon for every little thing. Finally, after driving for a solid 6 hours without stopping, it was really dark at this point, David stopped by a Del Taco for the family to eat. Now, at this point, I guess Linda was really freaking out. She was like beyond terrified at this point, and she was hysterical and demanding to be taken home right then and there. Like, she was like crying and yelling and like was freaking out. Cinnamon said that David meekly obeyed Linda, and he turned the van around and headed home. They just got food to go. They did not stop to eat at the Del Taco. Now, Noelle and McLean, as they are, hearing Cinnamon recount this, they thought, of course, they knew the real reason why they went on that trip. It was going to be the trip where they were going to kill Linda. They just didn't know why David had chickened out. So the next day, on Sunday, David made Cinnamon unpack the car, which she didn't understand because they were planning on going on another trip the next day. But whatever, she did as she was told. And the next day, as we know, the trip was canceled on account of rain. And that night/early the next morning, Linda would be murdered. Cinnamon recounted that day. She said the family did indeed play Uno. Her mother's relatives had visited from Salt Lake. She confirmed what Brenda had said, that David put on a real good show of like being in a good mood and stuff, but yeah, Cinnamon knew he hadn't been in a good mood all that weekend. She said Arthur got angry at her as they were playing Uno because like I guess she kept like screwing him over and like he was losing and he was getting really angry. She got kicked out of the game eventually, like lost the game, so she was out. And then when she had been kicked out of the game, Linda asked her to do the dishes, and Cinnamon balked at this because this was the second night in a row. But Linda just, sighed and was like, please don't make a scene. Please just do the dishes, not with Grandma and Grandpa here. Like, please just do the dishes. She verified Manuela and Linda did argue over baby Crystal, verified that Manuela rocked Crystal to sleep, and then Arthur and Manuela left. Linda went into the shower, and Cinnamon said it is when Linda was in the shower that David and Patty came to her and said that it had to be done tonight. Cinnamon demanded to know, well, who do you expect to do it? And David told her, quote, you. If you love me, you'll do it. If you really love me, you'll do it. And then Cinnamon asked in a whisper, quote, how bad is it? David said that it was real bad. Linda would kill him any day now. Cinnamon cried, saying that she just wasn't strong enough to take a human life. And that's when Patty got angry and chastised Cinnamon, saying that she cried too much and that they would just discuss it later because, quote, I have a few things in mind. Yeah, Patty was very cocky and all in at this point. Linda came out then, and then, Cinnamon recounted her and David went to bed. And then Cinnamon and Patty ended up dozing in front of the TV in Patty's room. And like I said, they dozed and Cinnamon awoke them both, and then they shuffled off to bed. Then around 2 a.m., David awoke Cinnamon and Patty and told them, quote, get up, girls. We have to do it tonight. Cinnamon said that Patty leapt up immediately, as if she was expecting this early morning wake-up call. David led Cinnamon into the kitchen, brought out 2 or 3 bottles of pills, got a glass of water, and instructed his daughter to take all of them. When she asked why, he said that he wanted it to look like she was trying to kill herself. In case things didn't go through. She said she was scared, but he told her, quote, I have a feeling Patty's going to do it tonight. Cinnamon was scared, and there were a lot of pills. They were pretty big, but, she did as her father told her to, and she swallowed them. He then told her to go to the biggest doghouse, get inside. He had turned off the home security system so it wouldn't go off when she went out the back door. So he sent her out, and then he called her back and told her to go to her trailer and get her suicide note and burn and discard any practice notes that she had made. She did as she was told. He then told her to go to the doghouse, and the last words he spoke to her were, quote, now don't you go get crazy on me. Cinnamon got in the doghouse feeling nervous and dizzy from the effects of the pills at this point. She said she remembered hearing her father's car drive off. Then, quote, I heard something like, I wasn't sure it was a gunshot at first. So I went inside the doghouse where he told me to, and I curled up. I was in there shaking, and I heard 2 more of the same sounds. They were like right after each other, 2 of them, and I was shaking, and then I started getting sick, and I was vomiting really bad, and then I didn't hear anything after that. She said she had been standing near the garage when she heard the first shot, and then she didn't really hear anything more because of the effects of the pills at that point. Through her haze, she said that she heard her father saying from somewhere, quote, it's done, it's over with. She thought she also heard him say, quote, if they ask you, say you did it, okay? Remember what I told you before. You're not going to get in trouble. If they ask you, you did it. You did it. He told Cinnamon that Patty had shot Linda, but she had to take the rap because, she was young. He said, quote, if you love me, you'll do this. Cinnamon said that she thought she remembered telling him, quote, I love you, I'll do it, I'll do it. She said the next thing she remembered was vaguely being taken out of the doghouse and then waking up at the hospital. She really had no recollection of in between. She said her mother, Brenda, had come to see her first in the hospital, and then David, who reiterated for her to take the fall. Quote, don't make it complex. You'll confuse yourself. She said David had come to her while she was waiting behind bars as well. Quote, my father was confusing me, and Mr. Frigette had come to help. Remember, that was her lawyer. I had told him that I did it, and I guess my father talked to lawyers. My father came in and said, never mind. Tell them you don't remember anything. Tell them you don't remember anything at all. Now, Noelle and McLean, they knew Forget's style. They had both kind of come across him in the courtroom, and they knew that he was not one of those lawyers to straight up tell his clients to lie. So they knew that this was David alone telling Cinnamon to lie and say she had no recollection. Cinnamon said that Forget had come to her alone and told her that if Patty or her father were involved, that she needed to tell him. He could protect her. But remember, Cinnamon being groomed and manipulated and fearing and idolizing her father at the same time had tied her lawyer's hands by saying, like, no, I did it. Now, when McLean and Noelle asked Cinnamon, like, why are you coming forward now? Like, why now? Cinnamon said that she had come to realize that she had been used and manipulated by her father, and she had been forgotten. And I think it was just, all of this stuff over the course of time, right? Less and less visits, not even giving, his daughter his address. And then when she would call over there, she must have had some kind of contact number. David always say that he was, sick or in ill health, but then Manuel and Arthur would tell her that, like, oh no, he's out and about and gallivanting around and doing all this fun stuff. And at this point, Cinnamon started to believe that her father didn't even have any health problems, that he was just making it all up, that he was a hypochondriac, and it was just an excuse. And then I think for her, the final straw was Patty becoming pregnant. Like, she knew how possessive her father was. Like, she knew that even before this, that, David held a tight control over the women in his life, especially after that thing she saw in the Kmart. Yeah, there was no way. She's like, of course, Heather is my father's daughter, of course. She said she had also discovered that David had cashed out on those fat life insurance policies over Linda. Yeah, she was floored at this. David had straight up lied to her because she had straight up asked her father if he had received any money for Linda's murder, and he told her no. She said he was acting really paranoid and scared that the DA was watching him and stuff and knew where he lived. Cinnamon told him, like, well, Dad, they probably already know. And that's when David just went into full-blown panic mode and was like, you think? And just, I think over time, I think all these behaviors of David and right up to his virtual abandonment of her just kind of chipped away at the trust and fear Cinnamon had in her father, She said, quote, I feel I was manipulated when I was younger, and I started dealing with it within myself. And I feel like I was manipulated by my father, by the whole thing, because he would say, if you love me, you would do this. And inside, I knew it was wrong. Now I know it's wrong, and I don't think I should take all the responsibility for what happened. Now, after Noelle and McLean left Cinnamon and presented Robinson with their findings, it was decided that the only way that they were going to get a shot at David and bringing him to trial and making the charges stick was to get him to incriminate himself on tape. Cinnamon was just too easy of a target to take down in court, so they needed some other evidence, right? So it was decided that Cinnamon would wear a wire, and they would try to get David on tape incriminating himself. Cinnamon agreed to be wired, and they agreed that on her next visitation day, which was the 13th, only 3 days after she had met with Noelle and McLean, they were going to try to get David up there to visit Cinnamon and see if they could get him on tape confessing. So Cinnamon contacted her father and acted very, very sort of secretive and sort of like stressed and told him that he needed to get up there now because she had something of great importance to discuss with him. And so he needed to get up there. And David, of course, frustrated and paranoid that he couldn't get anything out of Cinnamon, decided to visit his daughter. So on the afternoon of August 13th, 1988, David visited Cinnamon. Who knows the last time he had visited her? Who knows? Now, when she said hello, the first words that he said to her were, quote, "No, I love you." David was very manipulative, all right? And now that Cinnamon's eyes had been opened, it was so clear to her now. So Cinnamon was wired, and Noelle and Robinson were actually listening in real time. There was also video recording equipment recording Cinnamon and David meeting. And yeah, Cinnamon started to try to get her father to incriminate himself. So in the conversations, David mentions the mob, that that Linda and Alan were plotting to kill him, that Alan was, quote, stalking him, and that Linda was a drug user. Quote, Linda and Alan were apparently tied to some group that Alan dealt drugs with. I don't know if Linda owed money, but they wanted data recovery. They wanted it bad, real bad. Cocaine, PCP, and all kinds of drugs. And they found them on and in Linda. She was apparently a heavy user, and I had no idea. And of course, this was an outright lie. There were no drugs found in Linda's system. There was a minuscule amount of the metabolite of cocaine found in her system, but according to experts, this could have been introduced into her system a number of ways, and they had no way of knowing how long it had been in her system. David went on and on and on about the mob, how they wanted data recovery, wanted to get rid of him, and they wanted to steal the process from him. But remember, Cinnamon's not 14 anymore, right? Her eyes have been opened, and she saw right through her father's bull. And that is when David then flipped, all right? Like many master manipulators and many just morons who really have nothing of substance to say, David would flip-flop and see what would get his audience. What did his audience like? And so he changed tactics to try to get Cinnamon on his side, since she wasn't buying the Linda Allen mob thing, you know. He then told her to, quote, remember, Linda wanted you out of the house. Linda wanted you gone. But still, Cinnamon stood her ground, dude. And she said, quote, Linda never told me she wanted me out of the house. And then David changed tactics again, since that wasn't working. He told her, quote, well, Patty said if worse comes to worse, she'll confess to it. She'll take your place. Yeah, now he was offering Patty up as a sacrifice. And when Cinnamon just asked him, like, why can't you just tell the truth? Why can you not just tell the truth? David replied, quote, you could tell them the truth if you don't tell them the whole truth, okay? Because then we'd all go to jail. And he was referring to himself, Patty, and even Arthur. But then Cinnamon said, quote, I feel stupid, and I was gullible enough to do it. To do what? This had Newell and Robinson raise an eyebrow, like, do what? David advised his daughter to keep feigning that she had no memory of that night, and to just keep repeating that because he was working on getting her released. He told her he would get Patty to confess to the crime, and he even tried to pin the blame on another Bailey brother, Larry, even Alan. But David himself was never to blame. It was always someone else's fault. He explained to Cinnamon that he just couldn't confess. He was in failing health, and he just would not survive behind bars. He said he'd rather kill himself. He also dodged Cinnamon's blunt questions about baby Heather's parentage. And after the conversation with Cinnamon, David started getting very nervous. Nervous that Cinnamon was beginning to crack. That evening, when he was home with Patty, he told her that when they went to visit Cinnamon, Patty had to tell her that she was going to confess to the crime, all right? They had to keep Cinnamon happy. 2 weeks later, on August 27th, David visited Cinnamon again, this time bringing Patty and baby Crystal along. Again, questions about Heather's parentage were avoided, despite Cinnamon pressing them both. The conversations floated, about mundane things, until Cinnamon broached the subject and straight up asked Patty about the plan for Patty to trade places with her and confess. Patty seemed very apathetic and said that she would do it if that's what Cinnamon wanted. Cinnamon said that she just wanted the, quote, truth. David reiterated that she should keep feigning not having any memory of that night, and that Patty would confess, taking Cinnamon's place. But then Patty saw a flaw in this and was like, well, wait, what if they asked me why Cinnamon took the pills? David said for Patty to just say that, just say that you gave them to Cinnamon. And then Cinnamon just, interjected and was like, why can't we just tell the truth? David and Patty then suddenly had amnesia about that night. And they actually didn't remember much of that at all. Yeah, they were pretty much gaslighting Cinnamon and making her, try to doubt what she remembered of that night. And they're like, actually, I don't really remember that after all. I don't really remember that. And Cinnamon was sitting there just dumbfounded, are you for real? David whined about his health and tried to even say that Cinnamon had it better behind bars than he did. Can you believe that? And David's lies and his stories just flowed out of his mouth so easily. No, it was Larry Bailey who had done it. No, it was Alan. No, actually, it was his father, Arthur. When he was alone with Cinnamon, he said, oh no, Patty had done it. He was scared of Patty. Oh wait, no, Patty was the one he trusted most of all. He was just spinning lie after lie, just one right after the other, just anything that would stick that Cinnamon would believe, but she wasn't believing any of it. And then finally, 3 weeks later, David, who was 36, and Patty, who was 20, were finally arrested on September 22nd. They were charged with murder along with 11 overt acts. In criminal law, an overt act is an action which might be innocent in itself, But if part of the preparation and active furtherance of a crime can be introduced as evidence of a defendant's participation in a crime. Robinson and Newell had also dug into the life insurance policies on Linda, discovering how, overinsured Linda was. And they also found out that David had purposely made it so that he himself didn't have any coverage. He was very detailed and honest about his, health past and his medical history, so of course he wasn't going to get approved for any life insurance policies, and David had done this on purpose. So they had dug into his insurance fraud to sort of strengthen their case. And then, in an interrogation with investigators, for 3 hours, David decided to talk. He tried to deny having any knowledge of the murder, tried to impress the detectives with his importance and his bravado, went on and on about his myriad of health issues, and said that, he may have to get up and go to the restroom very often. And David talked and talked and talked and talked and talked. In fact, he talked so much, Newell could hardly get a word in edgewise. But when Newell showed David the glossy photos of his encounters with Cinnamon and his discussions with her at the prison, suddenly David changed his story. He implicated Patty as the murderer, claimed he was, quote, scared of her, and even tried to say that it was Cinnamon and Patty working together who had murdered Linda. He admitted that he was aware of the murder plot, but he had been helpless to stop it. He was then booked into the Orange County Jail. Then it was Patty's turn in the interrogation chair. But she said nothing, claimed not to remember anything, and still didn't talk even after Newell showed and played those tapes where David was alone with Cinnamon and implicated Patty as the murderer and said that he was scared of her and stuff. Even after hearing those tapes, Patty still refused to talk. She too was booked into the Orange County Jail. Both David and Patty were held without bond, pleaded not guilty, and they would have to wait for their preliminary hearings in December behind bars. Now, while behind bars, David bribed and manipulated his way through the jail system. Although it should be noted, none of the inmates really respected David. They called him Dave to his face, which I guess behind bars, this is kind of like a slap in the face because nicknames, a lot of people have nicknames behind bars. This kind of grants more anonymity. And behind his back, they called David Hunchy because of the awkward hunched stance that he had. Or they called him Thurston, after Thurston Howell III from Gilligan's Island. Remember the rich guy? And David especially hated this nickname. David ended up hiring Joel Baruch as his attorney and hired Donald Rubright to defend Patty. And then, as the preliminary hearings were drawing ever closer, Cinnamon called up Newell in late October and finally told him the whole truth. Yeah, she still had not told him the whole truth, guys. She admitted to him that, she was in fact the shooter. She had pulled the trigger. But rather than feeling angry or betrayed, Newell just felt kind of relieved. He still had this nagging feeling that not everything had yet come to light. But with Cinnamon finally, admitting everything out in the open, they could head to trial with much more ease. And on Halloween, Newell visits Cinnamon yet again behind bars, and this time she told the whole truth. So everything she had told him up to the point that her father gave her the pills to swallow had been true. After he had given her the pills and she was swallowing them, he had went and conferred with Patty somewhere, and then he came back, took Cinnamon to the living room, and told her that one of them was going to have to kill Linda tonight. It had to be done tonight, and if she loved him and cared for him, she would do it. He then told Cinnamon to shoot herself in the head, quote, to look like I tried, like I was sorry. Yeah, he told his 14-year-old daughter to just, quote, graze herself with the gun, with a bullet to the head to make it look like a suicide attempt. When she told him that she was just too scared, he said that, well, we'll just go with the overdose then. You've already swallowed the pill, so it's fine. Can you believe that? Oh yeah, just easily graze, because that's so easy, right? He then gave her a pillow and instructed her to hold the pillow over the gun. Now at this point, Cinnamon didn't know what he was talking about. There was no gun. He then left to confer with Patty, came back and told Cinnamon that he was now going to leave, and that the two girls were going to have to, quote, take care of business. And if Linda wasn't dead by the time he got back, he was just going to leave them either by taking off or by Linda killing him. He then left. Patty walked to her bedroom. Cinnamon followed her and saw her wiping a gun with a towel. David had handed her the weapon. Patty gave the weapon to Cinnamon and asked, quote, Daddy told you what to do with the pillow? I know, gross. She thrust the gun in Cinnamon's hand and kept repeating instructions to her, telling her to just go in Linda's room and pull the trigger. Just go in Linda's room and pull the trigger. That's all you have to do. Just repeating this. And so Cinnamon, with the pillow, went into the master bedroom. Quote, I don't know where I was standing in the room because I was too scared. I just fired the gun. She didn't know if she had hit Linda, didn't know where exactly she had fired or what. She had immediately run back to Patty's room and had panicked because the pillow had gotten stuck in the gun. Patty was in her room holding baby Crystal. That's what David David had told her to do. And then, holding baby Crystal, tried to tug the pillow free of the loaded gun. It was stuck in the trigger. Yeah, she was holding a baby. Patty was holding this baby and trying to wrestle with a loaded gun and a pillow stuck in its trigger. Cinnamon tried to help too, and of course, the gun discharged in Patty's room. Thankfully, the baby was not hurt. After the ringing in their ears stopped, that's when they heard the muffled moans and whines of Linda in the bedroom. After handing Patty back baby Crystal and Patty handing Cinnamon back the gun, Patty had finally gotten it free from the pillow. Patty told Cinnamon to go back in the bedroom. And this time when Cinnamon entered the dark master bedroom, she said she couldn't hear anything anymore, but she fired off into the darkness once again in the general area that she knew Linda slept. She dropped the gun, went to her trailer, got the suicide note, and got into the doghouse. When Noelle asked her, why did you lie to me before? She said, quote, because I'm ashamed that I loved my father enough to shoot Linda. I'm ashamed of it, and I didn't want to admit it or accept it. Cinnamon had actually called her mother Brenda the day before she called Noelle and confessed to her mother the whole truth. She was finally ready to process what she had done. She was finally ready to really process it, you know? Meanwhile, David was attempting to love bomb Patty behind bars. He had sent her countless letters, just, oozing romance and love bombing. He'd had plenty of experience in it, right? And that's what he was doing now. He even wrote her letters disguised as being from Doug and promised her everything that she ever wanted. They would openly be married, he would recognize Heather, and they would go live in their castle and live happily ever after. But the letters he was getting back from Patty, they weren't reassuring, and he wasn't getting what he wanted from Patty. They were very short and very suspicious. And when that didn't work, he resorted to emotional blackmail, saying that he was dying. He had found someone on the inside to help him commit suicide. He was pulling out every trick he had used to manipulate and groom her. He really had to ensure that he did not lose Patty as an ally. I believe he was aware that police had showed Patty the conversation he had with Cinnamon, where he said he was afraid of Patty and was implicating her as the murderer. I'm pretty sure he was aware of that, and so he was trying really hard to rectify that. And yeah, Patty was just not giving him what he wanted, and this caused him to panic and get paranoid. He wanted Patty to tell him outright that she would not testify against him, but he was not getting that. Now, since they were man and wife, Patty could not be forced to testify against David, right? However, if David wanted to invoke that privilege, he would also have to openly acknowledge the union between him and Patty, and that could open up a whole other can of worms for him. And turns out, David had every reason to fear Patty. She was turning against him. Finally. So on November 7th, Noelle sat down with Patty and Rubright, her lawyer, because Patty was ready to talk. She had been really hurt and betrayed that David would just seemingly throw her to the wolves like that. This really got to her. And she also felt righteous anger at David not acknowledging her daughter. She verified pretty much everything that Cinnamon had said. She told Noelle how David had slowly isolated her, how he wanted her and Linda to both drop out of school and finish their degrees at home while helping him with his business. She said how David began dropping little phrases such as Linda was changing and stuff. She didn't want to horse around with them anymore, and that's why it usually was just him, Cinnamon, and Patty. And he started telling her how he was afraid that something might happen to him. She said even when they lived in Yucca Valley, David had made strange comments about Linda being killed. Patty said one time in the car, on the way back from a shooting trip, they'd gone out to the desert and shot some targets or something. They'd stopped by a store and Linda had run in, and Patty had a gun on her lap. And David made a comment that if the gun had accidentally gone off, it would kill Linda, and quote, I'd be able to take care of everything. She thought maybe David was being hyperbolic or sarcastic or something. Remember, she didn't really get jokes a whole lot, so she didn't really know what to make of it. But then when they moved to Brea, the topic was dropped for about 6 or 7 months. And then when they were in Garden Grove in 1983, the topic really ramped up. This is also when the Linda Allen mob story would be created. Patty told Noelle that David always talked about different ways of getting rid of Linda. Remember that day that they went on the road trip to Del Taco? David had talked about pushing Linda off a cliff. If she was standing looking out over a cliff, he was talking about how either Patty or Cinnamon could just be running along and push her real quick off the cliff and get rid of her that way. Patty said that she couldn't remember the times that Cinnamon was there when they were hatching this plot, because David would let Cinnamon in on the plot, out, and then he would push her out, and then he would bring her back in, make Patty tell her everything they'd been discussing. So she couldn't even remember if Cinnamon was like in on this at this point. He would tell Patty that Cinnamon was just too young, she didn't understand and whatnot. And yeah, just back and forth, back and forth. Patty said that David would always make it seem like they had to kill Linda like that day or night, like it was very urgent. Quote, he always made it sound like it had to be done that day. He was always scared that someone was going to kill him or whatever. She said one evening, about a month before the murder, David had awoken her and told her that if she put a pillow in front of the gun and shot Linda through the back as she was sleeping, it would be painless and no one would hear and everything would be fine. David then gave Patty a gun and instructed her to shoot her sister through the back as he stood behind the bedroom door. She stood at the door with the pillow and gun in hand, but she just couldn't bring herself to pull the trigger. She told Noelle that up to that point, she hadn't really believed in David's paranoia, but at that moment, she took him seriously. Quote, I never agreed. It's just the fact that he hands you the gun, and I did take him serious then, but I never actually agreed. I felt obligated. But even still, she couldn't shoot her sister. David said it was just as well, because he pondered it would probably be better to have Cinnamon do it anyway, because she was the youngest at 14 and she would hardly get any time. And when asked why she agreed to plan the murder of her own sister, Patty said, quote, David had us believe that the family was the most important thing, and she, Linda, was going to disrupt the family, and we'd never be able to be a family again. My family was never a family, and this was our true chance of being a family and having everything that a family was supposed to have. And she was going to interrupt that if he had to leave, or they were going to get a divorce. Then we'd never be a family again. I guess I needed the fact there was a family. He said Cinnamon wouldn't serve that much time. We'd all be happy. The four of us forever from that day forward, no matter what. She also revealed in this conversation that yes, her and David were actually married. Now, after she talked to Noelle, Patty grew paranoid behind bars. David's lawyers were asking other inmates about her and, if they had heard what she was going to testify, what she was going to say, was she going to testify against David? And this all really rattled her. Remember, you got money, you can pretty much get anything behind bars, right? And David had the clout to find the information that he needed. There was actually an old friend of David's who posed as a Mormon lay minister to get access to Patty behind bars. In actuality, this guy was a crook with child molestation charges. No wonder him and David were such buds. And he was there to pressure Patty. He tried laying guilt trips on Patty about David getting the chair, showed her a fat wad of bills, and told her that her brother and sister-in-law, Rick and Mary, who were taking care of Heather for her at that point, and were pretty much the only family on her side, could be well taken care of if she just didn't talk. They could get them a brand new car, and that David could put endless money in Patty's jail account. And this guy really was doing anything that he could to con, charm, fear, or manipulate Patty into getting what David wanted. And that was, of course, for Patty not to testify against him. But at that point, Patty, she had grown more independent than she ever had, all right? She had been on her own more behind bars than she had in her life, right? And at that point, she was well aware of the power and control David had over her, and she was done, all right? She wanted to be done with him. And when Patty told Noelle what was happening, suddenly this Mormon lay minister never came around again. All of a sudden, inmates that were getting questions asked of them of Patty, that stopped. And on November 17th, Patty was actually placed in protective custody. And in another interview with Noelle later that same month, Patty, of course, confirmed that there never was a Doug, that her and David were sleeping together at the time of Linda's death, that she had gotten pregnant, and she told him how scared and nervous David had become, especially after that first visit with Cinnamon. On their way to the second visit, he told Patty they had to, quote, keep Cindy in a good mood so she wouldn't tell the police or anyone. She said David had continuously and repeatedly told her since the day of Linda's murder, quote, Alan and Larry are really the ones that killed Linda, and quote, I didn't want it to happen. And just, repeating these kinds of things, right? Which is just how propaganda and manipulation works, right? Kept trying to sort of gaslight her own memory, right? Like, oh no, it was really Larry and Alan that did this, right? And at David's preliminary hearing, which happened on December 19th, 1988, Baruch and Robinson duked it out in the courtroom. And they did everything but punch each other. The two apparently had a very deep rivalry. Baruch had already lost to Robinson twice in court, and he was really determined to win one case against this guy. The two yelled and attacked each other for the first couple days of the hearing. Baruch more so than Robinson. Baruch pissed off the presiding judge, a Superior Court judge judge, Floyd Schenck, and Baruch pissed him off to the point that he rose from his bench and threatened to throw Baruch behind bars for contempt of court. Baruch and Robinson also attacked each other in the press, of course. And yeah, it's amazing that these were like two professional like lawyers. Like these are supposed to be professional businessmen, and like the way they sniped and went after each other is just so funny. Some of the courtroom dramas with these lawyers, with the prosecutors and the defense, is just, it's so mind-blowing sometimes, because you're like, wait a minute, these are supposed to be like grown professional adults, and dude, sometimes they do act like children. They really do. Again, Baruch was acting more childish than Robinson. Baruch even tried to get Judge Schenck and Robinson thrown off the case and removed from the trial, and it said David at this point was like starting to get really nervous. It's not really good for your lawyer to piss off the judge, right? And yeah, he was starting to question who he had hired to represent him. And by the way, David was paying Baruch $250,000 for his defense. Cinnamon, of course, testified at this preliminary hearing, testified to what really happened in the years and weeks leading up to Linda's murder. She explained that she loved her father so much, she would do anything for him. She said her father wanted Linda dead, and, quote, one of us girls would have to do it, because he didn't have, quote, the stomach for it. And all throughout her testimony, Baruch continuously attacked Cinnamon, claiming she was only now changing her story because it was her, quote, ticket out of prison, right? Cinnamon replied that, she was well aware that her revelations may help her get out early, but she was, quote, ashamed, and felt the responsibility of Linda's death ought to be shared. Baruch also continuously interrupted Cinnamon's testimony, trying to get her off balance, and claimed that he couldn't hear her. And though Cinnamon was talking quietly, the court reporter could hear her words, so they were recorded, so it wasn't really that big of a deal. And it said, yeah, Cinnamon held up pretty well under cross-examination. Patty also testified, and this, of course, is what David was really worried about. She recounted everything that she had already disclosed to Noelle, reiterated everything Cinnamon said, and said how she and David continuously talked about Linda's murder. Quote, he said it would be best if we killed her first, before she killed him. He didn't have the stomach to do it himself. She testified that she hadn't wanted her sister dead, and suggested an accident instead where maybe she would be paralyzed. Quote, that way, she would always have to stay in bed. She wouldn't be able to get up and around, but we'd be able to stay together. But what really shocked the courtroom about Patty's testimony was when she opened up about her and David's relationship. And she verified that it started as early as 11 years old. Ugh. And she said this was also when David had first started to plant the seeds of doing away with Linda. He would complain to 11-year-old Patty that Linda had become, quote, so moody and scary, though she herself hadn't noticed anything. We know how David cons and charms and manipulates people, right? Especially someone starved for affection like Patty. He started grooming Patty as early as 11 years old and would always whisper promises to marry her after Linda was gone. Quote, it started when I was 11 and it continued until the day we were married. She tearfully revealed that from almost the day she had moved in, David had begun touching and molesting her. She had escaped one house of sexual assault into the arms of another predator. He told her that her mother had, quote, sold her to him for $10,000, which was the, quote, business loss her mother would sustain if she couldn't sell Patty into sex work. And considering how young, uneducated, and vulnerable Patty was, it's really no wonder, right, how easily David was able to mold and shape her into what he wanted. And since David was, quote, gentler when he did assault her, Patty just thought, this is just the way the world works. I guess this is just, the way things are. And David, of course, encouraged these thoughts by telling her that grown men often teach young girls about love. And that it was, really normal. I know, so disgusting, right? She said her and David were having regular sexual intercourse by the time she was 15, but by this time she had been fully groomed and duped and thought she was in full-blown love with David. Quote, anytime Linda left, there was usually some kind of physical contact. When she went shopping or took a shower. She verified that Cinnamon did see them that day in Kmart. Quote, I loved my sister, but I loved David even more. She confirmed Heather's parentage, and confirmed everything that Cinnamon had said. Like Cinnamon, she too held up well under cross-examination when Baruch accused her of actually being the killer herself and being manipulated by police as to what to say in her testimony, and was just doing what she had to do in order to get back to her baby, Patty said no. She was quite prepared to go to prison for the rest of her life for what she had done. Quote, "At least I can go with a clean conscience." It is said that David was visibly dumbfounded and shocked at Patty's testimony, completely shocked. He was so blown away that, yeah, his victim had finally broken free. On January 19th, 1989, David was ordered to stand trial for murder and conspiracy, and Judge Schenck also decided there was enough evidence to support a special allegation that David had plotted Linda's murder for financial gain. And this special finding meant that David was now eligible for the death penalty. It was also ruled at that time that Patty would stand trial in juvenile court since she was underage at the time of the murder. And while waiting behind bars at Orange County Jail, no, we're not done yet. Just wait. This is pretty wild. So, while waiting behind bars at Orange County Jail, David got himself in further trouble. So, he attempted to bribe an inmate and biker named Richard Goldie Steinhardt, and he wanted Richard to help him escape. And this was in February of 1989. Now, Richard was a very heavy hitter in the biker world, along with some other unscrupulous groups, and he had been picked up on a parole violation in December of 1988. So, during David's preliminary hearing. But in actuality, it wasn't really a parole violation. Richard was a pivotal witness in an upcoming trial, and they had picked him up to throw him in jail because at this point, Richard was a wanted man by some very powerful groups and dangerous people, and he also didn't really have much care for himself at that point, and he would have been more than happy to just let the streets swallow him up whole. So it was actually safer for Richard for him to be booked behind bars. And it was when he was booked into Orange County Jail that he met David. Richard said, quote, "I watched him and studied him and saw that David Brown did not have a real friend in the world. Probably never had. He was the abused little rag doll, the one with one eye, that the little girl gets mad at and socks a little bit, and then she goes and hugs the pretty dolls. David appeared to be that kind of person. Very vulnerable as far as being streetwise, but a ruthless person. Serious obsession. There was a very ruthless person inside." David immediately began to make friends with Richard as soon as Richard had been booked. Now, Richard, who is a smooth operator and knows very well what he is doing. Like, seriously, if you read the book, it goes into a brief history of who this guy was, like, super fascinating, was able to gain David's full trust and confidence. He said the two would talk about escaping prison, wreaking revenge, and starting over on a brand new continent. Now, since David knew Richard would do just about anything for a price, and had, including murder, and Richard was due to be getting out, David was going to pay him $300,000 to take care of some things for him on the outside. And this included burning down his home and motorhome, of course, for insurance. Richard said he had no problem doing this. And yeah, he nonchalantly admitted that, like, yeah, dude, I was totally gonna do this. Now this just spurred David on even further. And it escalated to having Richard help David escape prison. David was being taken to the dentist by the sheriff's deputies periodically, and he wanted Richard to hide, and during one of these visits to spring David out of prison. And Richard was gonna do this for an additional $50,000. Again, this guy was serious and had serious connections to avoid jail time too. Like, this guy was a serious player. Additionally, David also wanted Richard to kill Patty along with Robinson and Newell, telling Richard he would, quote, "make it worth your while." David reasoned that if Robinson and Newell could be murdered, new prosecutors would be brought on board, and David, has a right to a speedy trial, and this would put the prosecution at a significant disadvantage because they wouldn't have time to catch up on the case. Robinson was to be killed first, then Patty, and then Newell. David also, get this, had potential hits on Brenda and her second husband, Tracy Sands. David had never forgiven her for giving birth to another man's child. And he also had potential hits on Larry Bailey and Alan Bailey. But those 3 or 4 hits, he wasn't sure if he wanted Richard to take out those people, but he for sure wanted Patty, Newell, and Robinson taken out. He told Richard that after the hits, he would tell Richard to go into the desert and give him explicit instructions, and it would lead him to the $3 million that David had buried out there. He said the two of them could then head off to Australia, where he owned 25 acres of land, and they could both ride off into the sunset to start fresh. And Richard, again, had plans to do all this, guys. Like, Richard had done much worse in his life for much less. But as he read more about David's case and read about, like, the grooming and the molestation and stuff, that rubbed Richard the wrong way. And he thought David was, quote, caca, and thought he was slime. And was like, you know what? I I don't think I do want to do any of this for him. And one day, Richard confided in David's, like, right-hand man behind bars. Now, this right-hand man was actually a known snitch. And so Richard was telling this snitch about what he really thought of David and was like, I don't know. Like, I don't know if I'm gonna do what he wants. And the snitch told Richard, like, I'm glad to hear you say that because, I kind of ratted you guys out to the DA. The snitch had also informed Newell that David had tried to get, his girlfriend, the snitch's girlfriend, to somehow get herself locked up behind bars with Patty. And she was either supposed to, like, discredit Patty, you know, when they have inmates testify against each other and say that, like, oh yeah, Patty said she made it all up or whatever. Or she might have been made to take Patty out. Not quite sure. There's like a little like conflicting reports about that. Now, when the snitch told Richard that, like, you know, hey, I ratted on you, Richard was like, okay, fine. So he called up the DA, you know, Newell, and informed him like, yo, okay, everything the snitch told you was true, but here's something that the snitch didn't know. You and Robinson were on my list. Yeah, you guys were on my hit list. And it was then decided that, just like they had done with Cinnamon, in order to nail David for these attempted hits, they would have to get him to incriminate himself on tape. And like with Cinnamon, Richard agreed to be wired. So Richard, working with the prosecution, set David up in a series of recorded conversations. And these were conversations the two had where they reiterated their plans and discussed the order in which the arson, the escape, and the murders were to happen. All in all, there were 26 audio and or video recordings of David scheming with Richard. David also told Richard that he had authorized Baruch to pay his brother Tom or his parents installments of $1,700 and $10,000. And, you know, they were gonna give those to Richard. Now, David, you know, relished these plans. He thought he was like, you know, a little badass. And he stated outright that he wanted Newell and Robinson dead. Just straight up said it on the tape. He said he also didn't care if cops were killed, and this was in regards to his prison escape. Quote, when it comes down to survival, okay, I'm not egotistical at all, but I think I'm worth more than they are. The they being everyone he planned on murdering. And this include any officers or any other person that would be collateral damage. Yeah, he just didn't care. David thought he was more important than them all. Now, the payments that I just got, the $1,700 and the $10,000 payments, they were handed to Richard by Tom, because remember, they were really furthering this ruse. So first, they made it seem that Richard was really out of jail and gotten out, when in actuality, he was just transferred to a separate facility. And then they allowed Richard out to collect these payments from David's siblings to, again, further this ruse, right? And then, finally, on February 13th, 1989, Richard falsely informed David that Newell and Robinson were successfully killed. And David was just super ecstatic. You know, he replied, you know, quote, oh, all right, like, I love you, man. I love you. Like, he was so happy. $11,000 was then given to Richard by Tom, and this was within an hour of Richard telling David that two of his enemies had been killed. And by the next day, Valentine's Day, David discovered that it was all a ruse. It was all a ruse. Not only were Newell and Robinson very much alive and kicking, everything had been a setup. And on the 15th, David was charged with 3 counts of solicitation to commit murder, solicitation to commit perjury, subordination of perjury, and conspiracy to commit arson. One of David's lawyers said that he, quote, was surprised, shocked, and distraught. David's trial was also pushed back, since his case was even bigger now and even more complicated, right? And David would now have to have 2 trials, one for soliciting Linda's murder and one for soliciting the murder of Newell, Robinson, and Patty. Now, Patty was shaken but not surprised when she discovered that she was on David's hit list. She had completely broken from his spell at this point, come to realize that he had conned and manipulated her. Remember, this was like the most on her own Patty had ever been in her life, and her eyes were opening. While in jail, awaiting her trial, she was able to obtain her GED, and she said though she was in jail, she obtained a new kind of freedom behind bars, funnily enough. She discovered a new kind of freedom that she had never known. Remember, I mentioned this earlier, her family had pretty much abandoned her at this point. I think her older brother Rick and sister-in-law Mary were the only ones who were even remotely on her side, and they were the ones caring for baby Heather. Manuela and Arthur were caring for baby Crystal. And yeah, Patty talked about how she knew she was going to have to live the rest of her life knowing that she helped plot the murder of her sister. And though she did seem to be progressing behind bars, it definitely was a touch and go thing. You know, there were ups and downs. She had tried to hang herself while behind bars. She had tried to commit suicide. So, you know, she did have her ups and her downs. And in May of 1989, Patty ended up pleading guilty to first-degree murder. Quote, "I pleaded guilty because I know what I did was wrong. Real wrong. I'm just sorry it ever happened. I just wish I could make it all go away. You never realize how much you miss someone until she's gone, and I'd give anything in the world to have her back now. I have to live with this for the rest of my life." Patty ended up sentenced to 4 years at the California Youth Authority in Camarillo, where Cinnamon was serving. David's murder trial finally began on April 25th, 1990. He was judged before Donald A. McCartan, and his trial would end up lasting 5 weeks. David's defense was now run by Gary Polson and Richard Schwartzberg. Baruch had resigned in August of 1989. They maintained that it was Patty and Cinnamon who had plotted to kill Linda, and that the only reason the girls were coming forward now was so Cinnamon could get out of prison and Patty could cut a sweet deal. The defense admitted that the jailhouse murder for hire tapes were pretty damning, and they did prove that David tried to have people killed, but they tried to argue that this was a last desperate attempt of an innocent man who felt he was being closed in on all sides. Okay. The defense, of course, had tried to get the tapes thrown out, but of course they were admissible and allowed in. Cinnamon and Patty testified, reiterated pretty much what they did at the preliminary hearing. And in the middle of Cinnamon's testimony, when she was recounting when her father made her take all those pills, I guess it was right at this moment that, like, it finally sunk in 100% that her father had very well intended to kill her that night as well, or at the very least, didn't care if she died that night. And she had this realization when she was on the stand, and she tearfully glanced at her father and said, quote, "I know it all now. I know." Patty testified, verified everything Cinnamon had said, and she also said that the night of the murder, David told her that if they were both arrested, that she was to take the blame, and for the next 30 days after the murder, he was paranoid that investigators were watching him, and that was why he didn't go to Cinnamon's trial. She also said that after Cinnamon had summoned her father for those recorded visits, David had doubled down on his paranoia, convinced that the house was bugged, and once again said that she was to take the blame and leave him out of it entirely. Quote, "David said for me to take the blame. He'd get a lawyer for me, take care of Heather, and make sure I had everything I needed or wanted while I was in jail or prison." She also verified that he had told her to lie at Cinnamon's trial and say that Cinnamon was, severely mentally impaired and had a lot of problems with Linda. She admitted that this was a lie. Now, throughout both of the girls' testimonies, Polson accused Robinson of leading them. Robinson accused the defense of constantly trying to disrupt and fluster Cinnamon and Patty. However, it should be noted that Robinson was warned by Judge McCartan on numerous occasions about leading both Cinnamon and Patty through their testimonies. And he had done this to the point that the judge actually threatened Robinson with contempt of court and threatened a mistrial if he didn't stop. He also ordered Robinson to stop calling Cinnamon and Patty by their first names. And Robinson persisted, though, even asking the same question 4 times after 4 sustained objections. Robinson was chastised several more times, to the point where the court was forced to explain to the jury, what leading questions are, why the defense was objecting, and why the judge was sustaining all these objections. They pretty much had to, break it down for the jury, this is why this is going on. The defense's witnesses mostly comprised of lawyers, Cinnamon's lawyers, Patty's, even Newell was called by the defense. And again, they were trying to pin the blame on both the girls and trying to use their past statements against them, even though the 2 girls had already admitted all of their lies, And though the defense tried to pin the blame on the 2 teenagers, apparently their entire argument shattered when the jury heard those recorded tapes. And it was specifically the murder for hire tapes. Those were the most damning evidence against David, I guess. Now, the jury was not informed that Robinson and Newell were 2 of David's targets. David wanted to testify in his own defense, but his lawyers knew that was not a good idea. So you see, while those tapes of David talking to Cinnamon, while his tape of the interrogation that he had with Newell, and of the murder for hire tapes, while those, to most normal people, right, David came across gross and slimy. He would talk about, graphic sex him and Linda had. He would joke about sex with Cinnamon. It was weird. And there's a reason why those tapes were especially damning. It wasn't just the specific things David was saying, it was the way he was saying things. things. It was like things that he was saying not directly related to the subject matter, and it was weird. But to David, he killed it. He killed it in that interrogation. He killed it during those recorded conversations. And if his lawyers just let him take the stand, he'd be able to work all this out. It was just all a misunderstanding. Yeah, that was David's perception of those damning tapes. So yeah, there's a reason why his lawyers were like, yeah, no, you are not taking the stand in your own defense. After approximately 7 hours of deliberation over the course of 2 days, on June 15th, 1990, David was found guilty on all charges. And on September 17th, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At his sentencing, Judge McCartan said in part, quote, "Mr. Brown, you're a scary person. I have some concern for my own safety. You don't look like Charlie Manson, but you look a lot saner than your own defense attorney. But look what you did from jail. Look what you did to your own children, to your sister-in-law. It's scary to think you can manipulate people and do all this and not bat an eye. You're a master manipulator. You seem to have a pleasant personality, but you had no concern for your daughter, your sister-in-law, for your wife. Mr. Brown, you make Charlie Manson look like a piker." In prison, David was put in a protective housing unit due to the publicity of his case. He pouted at the judge's words and said that he didn't have to be so mean about it. Quote, "He didn't have to say that about Manson." On July 23rd, David pled guilty to the charges that he tried to have Noelle, Robinson, and Patty killed and was sentenced to 6 years to run concurrently with his life sentence. And after his conviction, David would maintain his innocence, saying, quote, "I got a bum deal. The truth is, I loved Linda quite a bit, more than I ever thought it was possible to love a woman. Those prosecutors would rather have actual murderers loose than me, but they're the ones that have to live with it, because I guarantee you they," referring to Cinnamon and Patty, "will kill again." It should also be noted that there are many investigators who thought that David did intend to kill Cinnamon that night, thus eliminating his wife and daughter. However, no charges were ever brought against David for the attempted murder of his daughter. He attempted to appeal his sentence, but it was denied in April of 1992. In 1991, the case was the subject of a made-for-TV series called Love, Lies, and Murder. And that same year, Cinnamon appeared on an episode of The Oprah Winfrey Show, alongside Anne Rule, who wrote the book If You Really Loved Me. And in this interview, Cinnamon told her side of the story. She explained how her father had manipulated her over the years by, repeating the same thing over and over, like, "Oh, if you really loved me, you would do this. Oh, a real daughter would do this." She said she thought the made-for-TV series sensationalized a lot of the crime, and she didn't think it should have been turned into something like that. She also said that it wasn't until her father's trial that she realized he had intended for her to die that night. She said she felt, quote, hurt and, quote, betrayed by this revelation, but stated, quote, "He's still going to be my father, and no matter what he did, he's always going to be my father, and I love him." But she said that she didn't agree with the things that he had done. When asked why she decided to come forward, she said she was just tired of being lied to. Patty and David hadn't told her they were married, hadn't told her they had a baby, and while David told her that he was working on getting his daughter released from prison, she found out from, family members he was out shopping and gallivanting around. And after a 2-1 vote by the board, Cinnamon Brown was paroled in February of 1992. She served 7 years in the California Youth Authority, and she was released when she was 21 years old. She could have been in the Youth Authority, remember, till she was 25, and then sent to a regular prison after that. There was one dissenting jackass, and he had never believed in Cinnamon. His name was Victor Weishart Jr., and he was the lone dissenting opinion, and he wrote in his opinion, quote, "Although she has made great progress in her program, her reasons for the well-planned, cold-blooded killing of her victim are not to be believed." Not to be believed, like, you had how many independent sources, verify, that is why she planned that. What a jackass. Robinson himself disagreed, saying, quote, "The real story is the courage of this kid who was abandoned by her family, a 14-year-old kid who was completely brainwashed for a number of years by her father, who herself has been the victim of terrible crimes, and has now paid her debt to society, maybe even more of a debt than she should have. Yet her battle would be a very, very tough one. Because her case is of such high profile, a girl who has been earmarked as killer for the rest of her life." Robinson and Noelle had actually petitioned for Cinnamon to be released even sooner, but yeah, they were happy when she was finally released and they fully supported her. Cinnamon did go on to marry in 1994, but I read several sources that said unfortunately her first husband took his own life. And then I read that she eventually got remarried is to a police officer of some kind. And I think either Newell or Robinson had actually introduced them. And I read that she currently has her own family now, including a son. And yeah, is just trying to live her life. Patty was released in 1993, and she ended up regaining custody of Heather. She ended up marrying a prison guard. I read that she actually met this guard while she was imprisoned, and she ended up giving birth to twin boys in 1994. Not exactly sure what she's up to today. I read one source that said that she did stay in contact with Crystal, and I know she wanted to have a relationship with Cinnamon, but Cinnamon wasn't ready for that. She tried having a relationship with Cinnamon when she was locked up with her, and Cinnamon, was not really ready for that. Do not know if Patty and Cinnamon ever reconciled, ever met. I know Crystal really wanted to be in touch with Cinnamon, that was her sister. I don't know if they ever got in touch. I know Cinnamon talked about in the Anne Rule book that she wanted to be in contact with Crystal, but remember, she had been raised by David's parents, and apparently David's parents had completely disowned Cinnamon after she had confessed and helped get her father put away. Can you believe that? What awful people. And I know Arthur finally died. I believe he passed away in 1993, and Manuela is also dead now. She passed away in 2005. And in March of 2014, David Arnold Brown finally died at the age of 61 years old in a prison hospital from natural causes. I read Linda and David's child, Crystal. She goes by Crystal Hinton. She was, again, raised by Arthur and Manuela. She does actually have a YouTube channel, and she did post a video that sort of updates people who are fascinated with the case and, about her life. And yeah, she married and had kids of her own. She has a few videos and shorts on there, but last I checked, she hadn't uploaded anything since 2018. And yeah, that was the case of David Arnold Brown, y'all. Can you believe that? Can you believe this a-hole? Not only is he a sicko pedo freak, but to have your own daughter, to treat your own children like that. But of course, right? Because those aren't people to David. They're just things, right? I don't know what this dude's issue was. He obviously had a lot of issues with women. He obviously had a lot of mommy issues. And man, I think we can safely all say that the world is such a better place with him dead. I hope Cinnamon is, living her life. I hope she was able to get past all of that and live a life. And I do feel sorry for Patty too. I'll admit, it feels like Patty is not quite as sympathetic as Cinnamon, you know what I mean? Probably just because, Linda was her sister. But let's remember, guys, it feels like Patty's been a victim almost since she was born, being molested by your own brothers, by the way. Ugh, that's so terrible. And then to go right into the arms of another predator. Yeah, I do feel sorry for Patty. I certainly hope that she has grown, and I do hope that, she has a stable, happy life as well. And yeah, please tell me, what do y'all think of this case? Isn't this wild? I couldn't believe when I read this case. It's so trashy. It's so gross. I don't understand people. I'm super close to my dad, and it just grossed me out. God, my dad would never do that. It's so gross. Ugh, thank God he's dead. I'm so glad he's dead. Rotten pieces, David, Please let me know. What are your guys' thoughts on this case? Let me know. Have you heard of this case? What do you think? Isn't it wild? Sorry it was so long, but again, guys, I just got so sucked in, and I just kept coming across detail after detail, and I was like, oh my God, I gotta mention this. This is wild. And yeah, let me go ahead and plug the book I read, my first Anne Rule book. Yeah, If You Really Loved Me. And yeah, this book is broken up, even though it has chapters, it is broken up into 4 parts. And I'll admit, I had to slog through the first part because it's about, the initial night of the crime and stuff. And I was really more interested into digging into who David was and how could someone find themselves being such an utter crap bag. You know what I mean? It's fascinating. Yeah, so yeah, it was a pretty good book. There's actually another Anne Rule book that I'm reading for another case. That one has me hooked even more than this one. But yeah, this was the book I read. If you are really into this case, and really got sucked in, highly recommend this book, because I know, you're probably thinking, there's details you didn't share. Yes, there are details that I have not shared, because, look how thick this book is. There's a lot of information. So yeah, if you're really into this case, highly recommend. And oh boy, I will let y'all go. Super long one again. But again, we had a lot to go over. Just a mind-blowing case. Next week is the Halloween case. It's actually a requested case. I came across it, and when I started digging into it, I was like, oh my god, this is the perfect Halloween case. So yeah, be ready for that next week. Until we meet again next week, I hope you stay safe and happy out there, take care of yourself, and remember, don't be a dick, don't be a douche, all right? Don't be like David. Please don't be like David. Just be a good, decent person, all right? All right, y'all, that will do it this week for Crime Dive. I'll see you next week for our Halloween episode. Bye-bye!